Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll profile painter Kent Esty. But first, joining me now, our guest is Kathy Knowles from Winnipeg. Kathy, thanks for joining us today.
You're most welcome.
You know, Kathy, as you're here today to talk about some important work that you do actually in Africa, and we'll get to that in a little while, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background maybe.
Well, I am 67 years of age. And you said already I live in Winnipeg. I haven't always lived in Winnipeg. I was born in Toronto, and we had an opportunity to travel to Ghana, West Africa, when we had 3 children, and I had my 4th child in Ghana. But before traveling to Ghana, I was a nurse. I worked on a pediatric ward for a number of years, and then I really gave that up, though, soon after we returned from Ghana. But going to Ghana, we were there for 4 years, leaving in 1989, and we came back in 1993.
All right, so you lived in Ghana from 89 to 93, it says. And we are here today to talk about the work now you're doing in Ghana with the Osu Children's Library Fund. Can you talk about maybe how, let's start at the beginning. How did this get started?
Okay, well, my husband is an accountant, and he went to Ghana employed with a Canadian gold mining company. So we lived in a community, a neighborhood, with lots of neighborhood children, and children attract other children. So within a short time, I got to know several of the neighborhood children, and it was quite apparent that they didn't have opportunities to read. And they would borrow our children's books, which went on for some time. And then I thought, why don't I create a library for these children? And this library was very informal. I had a basket full of books, and I gathered 6 children under a tree in our garden 1 day a week. So that was the beginning.
So yeah, the how and why you were there was not because of this. This grew out of just because you were over there.
That's right. We were over there, and I saw a need, and I didn't anticipate that it would grow as it did.
Well, so you saw a need and filled a need, it sounds like. How many trips have you made? And you're talking about 91-ish, when maybe you sat under that tree with a group of kids. How many trips have you made to Ghana since?
Well, we returned to Canada in 1993, and since then I've gone back pretty much twice every year since 93, so you can do your math. Mm-hmm. There was 1 year, the COVID year, when it first came, that I missed 1 trip, but otherwise I've gone twice a year, and occasionally I've gone 3 times a year.
So you're making many trips over. Talk about a little bit about the region of Ghana, what's it like, and then how many libraries have been built there since you've been involved?
Well, Ghana was called the Gold Coast until 1957. It's a country just north of the equator. It's sort of in the underbelly of Africa. And before I started, there is a Ghana Library Authority that does have a network of libraries, but it doesn't nearly meet the population. And there certainly was no library in our community. So that's sort of why I started something small, but it was meant as an informal reading session.
Well, I assume these libraries that you've been involved with, are they in more rural areas of Ghana?
Well, over the years, and I've done it now for more than 30 years, we've done different things. We've worked in different parts of Ghana, including many rural areas. But in more recent years, I've stayed to the greater Accra region, which does include villages outside of the capital city of Accra.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about, because I read here you actually used a 40-foot container and transformed it into a library. I mean, that's the kind of thing you're doing over there. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, I was looking for a place to extend the library after we left the country. My husband's job was for 2 years. It extended to 4 years, but we knew we were coming back. And a friend of mine, she was a pediatrician, said that she had a large compound and she thought it could be given permission, so permission was granted. And so I looked around and I purchased a container for $1,200 US. And this was a rusty container, so we raised the ceiling, we brought in electricity, we mounted a concrete pad for the container to sit on, and that opened in 1992. And now,
was that your first library? This is the first one?
That's right. So that was the first one. And since the 40-foot container was mounted, we've added an office. That was another 12 feet. We added 2 toilets. Then we extended it. We had a separate storage area and also a computer lab.
Now, did you tell me, or how many libraries since that the early 90s now have been completed that you've helped with? Do you know that number yet?
Well, we have sort of 9 freestanding libraries plus countless smaller initiatives.
Yeah.
I did a lot of work in schools in my early days.
Okay. Well, with that said, of course, you always think of libraries and books, but what about computers? Are computers used there, and is there a need for that?
Computers are used the world over, I think, by this time. And yes, we've addressed that. Not all libraries have computer access, but we have 2 libraries that have full computer labs, independent buildings for computers. Unfortunately, computers do break down, so there's one expense of purchasing the computer and then something else to maintain them.
So do you have a need for more computers? Is that what you're saying? I mean, could you use more computers if you had access to them?
We could. I'm mindful that I wouldn't want too many because, again, each computer has to be maintained. And Accra is right on the ocean. We have one library that's within maybe 50 yards of the ocean, and the salinity in the air is very high, so things just break down.
Mm-hmm. So what kinds of education do the children do they have access to in Ghana?
Okay, well, back in 1989 when we first lived there, basic education was not free, so you would have to pay to go to school. But soon after, education became free, and not only that, but in recent years, high school education is now free. They don't have the facilities to accommodate everyone full-time, but there is the assurance that there is high school education, but it's on a shift system.
Would it compare to Canada and the U.S. as far as they do sort of a K through 12 type thing, or is it something different?
Similar in terms of the number of years, but they have 1 to 6, and then they have a middle school and then a high school.
Okay, so what kind of progress have you seen in your visits over the last 30 years in the education opportunities for children in Ghana?
I say, it's taken a quantum leap when you think that early on you had to pay to go to basic school, whereas now education through to high school is free. That's pretty significant, especially for families that don't have the financial means.
Mm-hmm. So, what kind of feeling does it give you to know that you're helping make a difference in that part of the world?
I'm just one cog in the wheel, really. I work with a lot of very dedicated librarians, the cleaners, the security guards. We're all part of a team. So my role is certainly significant, but I play my part as everyone else does.
When you say your part, you said 9 libraries, I believe, you've been a part of, and you keep going back. So what is your role in those libraries? What do you do?
Well, over the years, I've been the contractor. I've gone to buy tiles. I've met with a mason, the painter. So I'm pretty much hands-on. We do have now a library coordinator who was employed by the organization 2 years ago, and the idea is that she's taking over more of my role. A big part of what I've done in past years, and I still continue to do to a lesser extent, is to visit municipal offices. And there's a lot of chasing required when you're following up on salaries and replace staff.
Mm-hmm. So what can citizens do, U.S. and Canada maybe, to affect change in places like Ghana? And can they volunteer? Can they help fund it? What can they do?
Well, there are countless organizations that are doing very good work, including many that are locally based in these countries. I can only really reference Ghana because that's where I've spent my time. As an organization, we're registered in Canada. We're always soliciting for funds. We do have the capacity to take maybe 2 volunteers a year, but we're very small, so it's difficult to manage large numbers.
So what's the political landscape in Ghana, and how's it ruled or governed?
It's a democratic country, and the first elections were held when we lived there in 1992. And the presidents have 2 terms.
Well, it's similar to the United States, and well, of course, Canada's rule. You can tell us more about that later, I guess.
Different.
Different subject. What about the college education? You mentioned that a little bit. So when they reach college age, is it a given that they have access to college?
No, you have to pay for college. We encourage people to consider trades. You know, there's always a need for people in trades, whereas now there are more qualified people coming out of university, but they're not necessarily the jobs.
Well, I understand that you've written 55 books or so. Can you tell us, you know, why have you written 55 books? Tell us about it.
Okay, well, back in 2000, I did a study with schools to see the reading level of children and what books they had available. And I found that there was a real disconnect between the books they had available and the reading level of the students. So I approached a publishing company in Accra, Sub-Saharan, to see whether they could publish more for early readers. And that was the beginning of a partnership, because she said, did I have ideas? So I did a few books with Sub-Saharan, and then I went on to do a number of photo illustrated books, very simple, but showing pictures of children from Ghana.
Now, are these books targeted to be in Ghana, or can Canada and the U.S., do they have access to these books? Or
I don't do a very good job of marketing my books. The books are primarily published for children in Ghana, but they're available in Canada. We have books on our website.
Okay. With that said, of course, you brought me your newest book. This one you see here, The Land of Plenty, a word book. So tell us a little bit about this book and maybe who inspired it.
Well, this is my most significant book to date. I think it took me many, many hours, despite its simplicity as being only a word book. But I'm sure many in the audience would know of Richard Scarry, as our children did growing up. The late Richard Scarry wrote a number of word books where he pictured words and images in local scenes. So I found an illustrator working in South Africa, Toby Newsom, who said that Richard Scarry was why he became an illustrator. So I found the right illustrator for this task. I compiled a list of about 800 words. Then we divided them in categories according to where the word might best fit on the page. And then it was over to Toby with a lot of guidance, because he's not from Ghana. He's not been to Ghana. But together, I think we managed.
So what age are your books mostly written for? Is it early school years or preschool or what?
It's difficult to peg an age, because there are many in Ghana that don't have a very high literacy level. So a book like this would even appeal to someone in grade 6. Okay. There are lots of words, different scenarios. So I would like to think it's sort of ageless.
Okay. Well, let's turn back to your library. I understand there's a new Kathy Knowles Community Library. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, I first have to make it clear that I didn't name the library. I was surprised when I arrived. It was completed and my name was there. This was the library built in 2020 in the salt mining village of Kablevu, which is about an hour and a half from the capital city. And this library is quite remarkable. Children will sit on the floor often on mats and listen to stories as told by the librarians for maybe up to 2 hours, sitting quietly.
Wow. So you said you didn't name it, but obviously somebody from the government or community wanted to name it in your honor, obviously, correct?
I don't know exactly who decided, but I think the chief would have had the overall say, because chiefs are important in villages.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with libraries in these communities, you mentioned chief. So do you go to that region and talk to the chief about creating the library, or how do you do that?
It really depends. I work with communities where they can support the salaries of the librarians and staff members. Our organization doesn't pay salaries. It's up to the municipalities too. And this was a village where they signed a pledge, a written pledge on letterhead saying that they would cover the salaries. And that gave me the go-ahead that this would be a good community.
Can you tell us about any success stories or you know, maybe some children that you first encountered and now they've gone on to do things, and can you talk about any of that?
Well, there's one delightful young woman now named Talata. She would be getting on to close to 30, I think. I'm not sure exactly. And Talata was someone I knew from our Nima library. She came as a young child. We have a food program at that library where food is served several times a week, a hot meal. So she came, she was an avid reader, and we gave her a scholarship to attend school. School at that point wasn't free, so there was a scholarship for her to attend school. She completed her high school. She took time off to work and then gained admission to university. And many years later, she's now a physician's assistant with hopes of becoming an orthopedic surgeon. And Talata lives in a very humble home. And I think she still has to fetch water by the bucket, no running water. But she has her sights set high.
Wow. So with that, can you talk about some of the conditions there and how they differ compared to our lives in Canada and the U.S.? You just talked about this young lady still carrying buckets of water.
It's hard for me to give a blanket statement of Ghana. You know, they're very affluent people in Ghana, and there are those that struggle. You know, they live in communities where there may not be running water or well water, may not have electricity. Mm-hmm. And that's a challenge. But gradually the electricity grid is extending to the more rural areas.
Okay. How much do you stay in touch with the kids that you've known?
Well, I'm in touch with Ghana every single day. In terms of the kids, certainly the kids become adults, and I do hear from them time to time. I try to make contact. Sometimes they come and bring their own children now, and I see them with their children. Really?
In fact, before we came on the air here, you were telling me about, I believe, a young man you met with or are in contact with.
Yes, this is a young man called Mauli, and he came to our very first library, the Container Library, and attended for a number of years. And he's now a trained teacher, and as a trained teacher he was posted to a very rural area, and he started writing books following my example, photo illustrated books. And not only that, he started a chess club, and chess was something he learned at the library. So I thought, I want to see this man, Mauli. And I went to his village and stayed 2 nights. And in his village, yes, they don't have running water and they don't have electricity. His school was very basic, but he still managed to impart his knowledge to the children. Very inspiring.
Wow, it is inspiring. So, understand your last trip to Ghana was in May. You went there, was it to promote your book then, or what were you doing there in May?
Well, I go twice a year, so May was my first visit of this year, and a big part of it was preparing for the book launch, which was very exciting. We had children singing, they were performing. We have a dance troops actually, so children were dancing. We had adult learners who learn English at our libraries. They were presenting, so it took a lot of time to coordinate that event.
Okay, and of course you've said your next trip back, you're planning on going back in November, sounds like.
I go back every November.
So you stay very busy with that. So, but we are about to run out of time. So if people want to get more involved, if they want to learn more, where can they go? How can they get in touch with you?
We have a website. It's Osu Children's Library Fund.ca, and there's a contact. So I'm the contact. We have our address in Ghana. We have listing of all the libraries. If people are in Ghana, they can go and visit. They're always welcome.
Okay. Well, I would encourage people to go to that website and go to the libraries. I found it very interesting as I got a chance to look at it, and you're doing wonderful work there. So we wish you the best.
Thank you very much, John.
Stay tuned for more. Kent Esty is a member of the White Earth Nation of Ojibwe who considers himself a contemporary artist. His inspiration comes from the natural beauty surrounding him in northern Minnesota.
Although I've been painting for 40, almost 50 years, I consider myself an emerging artist. If you grew up in my family, you probably were some type of artist. That being beading, we learned loom work, and we also learned a lot about basket making. I was different in the family though, and I knew it when I was very young. I wanted to paint. I remember at 6 years old. I mixed dirt, gravel, sand, whatever I could find, lots of water. And I took that to our barn, and I remember putting my brush in there and stirring that and started to paint on the side of our barn. This is green. This is blue. This is red. And I know I could see those colors. And I remember thinking, even then, wouldn't it be wonderful to see real art? Let's jump ahead some 50 years or so. And now I'm going to galleries to see my work. I've been painting many years secretly, and I used to just paint with oils. Primarily they were landscapes, and very, very traditional landscape. And I was painting all the time. And so I started to give away my paintings, and then I started running out of family and friends. And so I started to throw away my paintings because I just couldn't store them anymore. And my sister found them, and she said, some homes that I'm in, they may not have a lot of artwork. Would it be okay if I gave them your work? From that, I got a call from the Mikonon Gallery at the Watermark Art Center in Bemidji. Please consider submitting some of your artwork to the opening of our gallery. I'm going to submit something that I feel is different, and that's what they selected. Prior to that, I would get the comment often, you're Native American, so your painting has to look Native American. And that's what I was hearing, but it wasn't what I was feeling. And so my response to that was to quit painting. If you know artists, you know that they don't do very well if they're not creating. And after a while, I spoke with my wife and I said, let's travel. Let's start looking at art. And I was introduced to a lot of Native artists that I didn't know existed. Many of them didn't look like there was something Indian in it. They were different. And I found the work of George Morrison. I remember walking into the museum, and I think it was the Whitney Museum, and seeing his work. My heart fluttered because I was seeing something that I had seen in my head. If I just had this freedom to paint what I wanted to paint, this is what I would paint. And I looked, and there's George Morrison, Ojibwe artist. And one of the statements that I'll never forget was that he said, I'm not a Native American artist. I'm an artist who happens to be Native American. The best way to honor your heritage is to paint what you feel. Then my work started to get more abstract and contemporary in nature, lots of color, lots of movement. And I went back to my landscapes, but they started to look a lot different. When I start a new piece, there's not a lot of pre-planning beyond the colors I know that I'm going to feature and the size of the canvas. I just start putting down paint. I like nice shades of browns and reds. I like to paint with the brightest colors I can possibly find. I like to use fluorescent paint in my work. Since I'm exclusively acrylics, I use the color right from the tube. Most of the time you'll see me and I'll have a tube in my hand or a jar in my hand, and I'm dipping my brush directly in that color and applying that on canvas. And my preference is to mix the colors on the canvas. That's fun for me. There's pieces of the painting that I'll really like, and then that'll change the whole piece. Sometimes I'm still that 6-year-old boy painting on the side of my barn and wondering, are people going to like this? Are they going to see the color? Are they going to appreciate the color? It's pretty awesome to think that where I grew up and where I'm going with my artistry has surpassed even my imagination.
Well, that's all we have for Prairie Post this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.